China's rising dragon falls hard, and this is shocking. Now, the rise of China and their dominance, taking over the world, has been talked about far and wide. They've said that kids should be learning Mandarin. Ray Dalio, he devoted an entire book to how the U.S. is in decline and China's taking over. You got Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum that's saying that China is a role model. But China's rising dragon appears to have been slain, both from internal forces, maybe more than external. But few have taken the time to think through what this means to global markets as the world's largest importer and exporter falls. So in this video, I'm going to break down the 5-point conflict happening right now, the real risk that China's facing internally, what to expect moving forward, how this affects the global markets, and what we should expect. So let's go. All right, welcome back. If you're new to the channel, my name is Mark Moss, and of course I make these videos to change the way you think about money, because most of what you've learned is wrong. Now, we are going to go into a global picture, a geopolitical picture that has to do with global markets and affects us and our own retirement accounts. And don't worry, we're all going to make it. We're all going to be okay because we're navigating this together. All right, so let's jump into this. The rising dragon. Of course, I'm talking about China, which has been talked about extensively by lots of people. In this book right here, The Changing World Order, written by Ray Dalio himself. As a matter of fact, I did a whole video kind of breaking down this book. We'll go ahead and link that up here if you want to go watch that video, or at the end, we'll link it down below. But anyway, Ray Dalio, of course, the guy is insanely smart, ran one of the biggest hedge funds in the world, Bridgewater Capital, probably spent millions and millions of dollars on his research team to put this book together, and I recommend it. But the problem is that the whole book is basically talking about how the U.S. is in decline and why China will take over. And of course, we can see all kinds of things throughout mainstream media like this. Billionaire investor Ray Dalio says China is a rising power. Now, this was in May of 22. This is the part that gets me. Equated the Chinese Communist Party's human rights abuses to alleged racial injustice in the U.S. So the CCP's human rights abuses, like locking up 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, like the government actually doing that, sort of like what happened in Germany, is the same as potential racial things happening in the U.S. I don't really get that. He's simping for the CCP. But we can see that over and over throughout mainstream media. We can see Chinese yuan will become a top reserve currency sooner than expected, says Ray Dalio. This is back in May of 21, the year before. Of course, for as smart and connected and rich and powerful as he sure is wrong about a lot of things. We can see that the Chinese yuan, which is going to be the reserve currency of the world, taking over the US dollar, is falling, I would say crashing against the US dollar. So that's certainly not coming true. It's not just Ray Dalio, it's all of mainstream media. We can see here CNN says China is rehearsing for when it overtakes America. This was January of 2021. And so people have been simping for China for a long time. And just most recently, everybody's favorite Bond villain, Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum, he declares on Chinese state TV that China is a model for many nations. China is a model. Let that sink in. We'll come back to that. All right, so they're the model. Let's see what's happening. They're rising. They're going to take over the world, learn Mandarin. It's all set in stone, right? Well, there's a lot of problems with China, and I've rattled them off. We've done other videos on China as well. And one of the problems that seems to maybe be the straw that's breaking the camel back, the prick that's popping this bubble, is this zero COVID policy that they've had in place. And so basically, China's decided they're going to lock down their people, hundreds of millions of people, like many times more than all the population of the entire United States, to lock them down to get COVID eradicated, get it to zero. And so they've been doing this. They've been having very strict lockdowns since January of 2020. And their goal is to have zero cases of the cold in a country of 1.4 billion people, which of course isn't really realistic, and it's causing massive problems, including shutting down their entire economic center, shutting down their import-export, shutting down their manufacturing, all of these things. And for what? It shows that there's really no logical reason if we look at the data. And so let's look at the data. All right, what does the data show us? It says that what we can see here is the case numbers. So we can see here in January of 22, and here we are right now, and what we can see is that the cases are exploding. Now this goes back to when the pandemic first broke out back in 2020. So they've had basically no cases, and now all of a sudden they're trying to have zero, and look at the cases blowing up. So they're doing nothing to stop the cases. Now let's look at another chart. This is again the data coming from China. And so over here is the cases, and we can see the cases have exploded since they've had a goal of going to zero, all right? But the problem is, now we can look at the deaths over here. And what we can see is that the deaths have come way down. So there's almost no deaths happening in a country of 1.4 billion people, almost no deaths happening, but yet they still have this insane policy. And the problem is that it's causing a lot of problems for them. It's basically outright subjugation for no apparent reason. So let's take a look at this. All right, some of this appears to be centered around Xi's power grab. President Xi granted himself, when I say granted himself, he unilaterally agreed, and if anybody dissented, then they disappeared, weren't heard from again. And he unilaterally granted himself a third term. Looks like he probably wants to stay there in power forever. Of course, why not? Anybody that went against what he wanted were kicked out, and he basically packed his cabinet with just loyalists, people that agreed with him, yes men, if you will. He's been using, obviously, lots of censorship to shut this down, also the harsh lockdowns for the control. So this is all a piece of it, of course, and we'll take a look at how he's doing that. But the problem is that people can only go so far before they're pushed to the breaking point, and that's what looks like it's happening. People are pushed to the breaking point. It's too thin. So all it takes is a spark. When all you have is dry kindling around, all you need is one little spark to light off an entire forest fire, and that's exactly what looks like it happened. And proverbial is a fire. All right, so there was a fire in an apartment building in Xinjiang. And because of the strict COVID policies that were happening there, the total lockdown, apparently, per news reports, the people couldn't get out of the building and rescue attempts couldn't get there in time. And I believe over 10 people died in this building. And this was a massive, massive piece. Well, maybe it wasn't as massive as other things that are going on, but again, all it takes is a little spark. And because of that, people really started coming out and pushing back on these zero COVID policies. All right, and it was the first time we really started to see this civil unrest really start to pick up. Now, of course, I've been reporting on civil unrest for lots of things, like when they had the bank shutting down and people couldn't get their money out. All right, so we've seen civil unrest happening. China typically comes in and is able to squash it pretty quickly, and we'll look at some of the ways they do that. But basically, this fire really seemed to kick it off, and then things really started to escalate. I'm not going to show you the videos because YouTube doesn't like it when I show you graphic videos of the people being protesting and being beaten in the factories. And so there was a labor unrest that was sparked at this Foxconn plant. All right, now this is a very key piece to understand what's going to happen with the markets, because the Foxconn plant is where China makes the iPhones. All right, this is a key piece for a few reasons. We'll come back to what Apple means to the US markets in a minute, but also I just like to bring the attention to what is Apple doing making phones over in the CCP China and mistreating workers over there. Not a really good look for American companies, by the way, but basically workers at the iPhone assembly plant tried to walk away, and when they weren't able to walk away, they met with massive retaliatory response, trying to push them back in and actually beating them in. Now, you can find these videos all over mainstream media, so go watch them. I don't want to show them here because I don't want the repercussion on YouTube for that. However, if you can't walk away from your job and you literally get beaten up for trying to leave, are you really a paid worker or are you something else? I'll let you make the case, and I'll also let you decide what you think should happen with Apple. Full disclaimer, I have an iPhone in my pocket, and I don't know what I'm going to do about it either. Anyway, it sounds like more like servitude than work to me, but what's happening is we've gone from a zero COVID policy to now it looks like a zero tolerance policy, and this could finally be what brings the end to communist rule. Now, some of the things they've been doing to really squash this, any type of dissent, is China has quelled protests by turning smartphone virus passports red. And so in China, they have a social credit score system. If your credit score drops below a certain level, you can't buy bus tickets, plane tickets, etc. You can't move freely. But they also have the health passport system. By the way, the G20, the top 20 countries in the nation, just met in the last 2 weeks, and they agreed that they want to roll it out for the whole world. And of course, they did, because Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum just said that China is the role model. So in China, they have the health passport system, and if they don't like what you're doing, they want to shut down the dissent or the protest or the uprising, they just turn everybody's passport red. And then you can't go anywhere. You can't buy anything, you can't drive anything, and so you see this is being used over and over throughout China. All right, so this is starting to really catch fire. Like I said, it was the spark, but now this forest fire is really spreading out of control. As a matter of fact, we're seeing massive social unrest and upheaval, and it is the largest protests that have happened in China since 1989, the famous Tiananmen Square, where they opened fire on a bunch of pro-democracy, pro-freedom students at the university, and they just openly fired on them. So we're seeing the largest protest that's happened since then. It's across all areas of China. I don't know how to pronounce all these names, so I'm not going to read them, but you can see them in a map right here. And this is new for China. All right. Typically, they might have one little protest that pops up. Well, frequently they have protests that pop up, but also frequently they're able to shut it down and contain it very quickly. But what we're having here is we're seeing them happening all over the place. I mean, we basically have half of China already here. This is where the fire started, right up here. So we can see that it's sweeping all over China. Now, I try to get my information from people, boots on the ground, people that have information there. We can see here David Moser on Twitter says he's lived in China for 30 years. Never seen such a brazenly open and sustained expression of rage against the PRC. All right, so this is against the Chinese Communist Party. WeChat is exploding with protest videos and furious vitriol, and civil disobedience is becoming rampant. Again, this is a big deal. Typically, they're able to shut this down really quickly, but at this point, the people just don't care. It's a serious test of the CCP governance, of course, the Communist Chinese Party. People say, oh, China's not communist, Mark, you know what you're talking about. It's literally in their name. All right, so what we see is the people are protesting. And again, another thing that's different about this is that we can see here since 1989, back to the Tiananmen Square incident, we've seen 5 main strands, repertories of contention in China. So we've seen a labor protest. We've seen the people in the farms, the rural protest before. We've seen the students protest before. We've seen the governance protest before. We've seen political dissent, all right? And usually they've been shut down pretty quickly, and they've all been separated. But now we're having all of this all come together and one, and so the entire country is going through this. We can see here, it says that the people in the streets are shouting, they're chanting, they're yelling, Xi Jinping, step down. The CCP, step down. The people are demanding the president step down. They're demanding the end of the CCP. Protest encouraged people to speak about topics considered taboo, including the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. The ruling Communist Party had ordered troops to fire on pro-democracy student demonstrators. So now people are starting to talk about things they weren't able to talk about before. What happens when the truth starts getting discussed? People start to wake up. And people want to talk about it, which wakes even more people up, which is exactly why they need to shut that down as quickly as possible. And like I said, there's tons of videos online you can go watch. I don't want to show them here because, you know, YouTube doesn't like it. What we can see here, another video, we can see that they've had enough of Xi's zero COVID. This is the biggest threat of his rule to date. All right, this is a well-known commentator from China. This is the biggest thing that he has faced. The people are shouting, we want freedom, calls for Xi to step down. This is considered sedition, not like what's happening with J6 over here in the US. This is like real deal, like people die over this. This is sedition punishable with imprisonment, never to be seen again, for calling for the supreme leader to actually step down. All right, now let's get to the economy part. Let's get to the global markets part. All right, so as this is all unfolding, we have an economy in China that is in disrepair. But what does it mean for us, whether you live in Europe or Australia or the United States? This matters to us, which is why we're taking a look at it. All right, so China is the world's production motor, right? They're producing the majority of goods in China that go to the rest of the world. We saw during the pandemic when supply chains broke down just how dependent we were in the United States and the rest of the world is on China actually manufacturing and shipping goods. So when they don't manufacture and ship goods, we have a lot of problems, but they're also the world's #1 consumer of everything. So they buy the most oil, they buy the most food, they buy the most concrete, they buy the most steel, like the most copper. So that not only do they produce the most that we all need, but they also buy the most. So if China shuts down, what happens with oil prices? What happens with copper? What happens with everything else? Where you start to get an idea. So how do we look at this data? Well, we can look at it in a number of ways. We can see that their PMI, Purchase Managers Index, which is a bellwether that shows us how the economy is doing, has been in contraction since 2020. All right. Now, even as other nations around the world are doing better, we can see how China's economy has basically just been dwindling down. It's not good. It's a very bad place for China. We can also see, we know that their real estate market's blowing up. We've talked about that extensively. They built, endless amounts of ghost cities just trying to put people to work. Now they're blowing up the buildings just to rebuild them again. But now they have so much debt, so much overbuilding, the entire real estate market's collapsing. And we can see how bad they're dealing with this. The mortgage rates are plummeting, trying to get any kind of stimulus they can into this market, but it's not working. And of course, I already kind of showed you this chart from a different graph, but we can see their currency versus the US dollar. The US dollar is gaining massive steam, meaning their currency is plummeting, it's losing value. So as they are shutting down, as the economic engine is shut down, their economy is crumbling. And again, this has massive implications. All right, so if China is the world's next net exporter, they're also the United States' trading partner. Now we can see not just the United States, 521 billion in the US, but Hong Kong, 300 billion, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Germany, 100 billion. It doesn't matter where you're in the world, you are going to be affected by this. All right, so if they're the importer and the exporter, what could happen? Well, we could see both plummet, which would be less global demand. We'd have supply chains disruptions like we've already had. And if we have those happen, less demand, supply chains breaking down, what happens? Inflationary pressure. Now, what is the Federal Reserve and actually all the central banks of the world trying to fight right now? Inflationary pressures. But these situations are only going to add to that situation. Back to Apple for a moment, we can see here that Apple shares slip on report the iPhone production is taking a big hit from unrest at factories in China. So again, if China can't control their zero COVID policy, they can't control the civil unrest, they can't get the people back working again, their economy crumbles, they can't import the same things anymore, they have supply chain disruptions, then we see companies like Apple taking a big hit. Now, how important is Apple to the US economy, to your retirement account? Well, Apple makes up the majority of the S&P 500 that's responsible for keeping it propped up. If Apple takes a big drop, then you can expect the index to take a big drop. You can expect your retirement account to take a big drop. It's a pretty big deal, not to mention all the people they keep employed and everything else. How much inflation could we expect to see from this? Well, we can see here in this report, Lorraine says that supply chain issues have been a major driver of U.S. inflation. Of course, we already know this. They talk about this, supply chain all the time. But how much? It says U.S. inflation will get stuck at 4% as chaos will continue to grip supply chain. So the Fed has a target of inflation at 2%. We got up to 9%. The Fed is committed to it, bringing it back down, right? So they want to get it back down to 2%. But based off of this, depending on what happens with China here, they may now not be able to get it below 4%. So now what does that mean for the Fed pivot that everyone's waiting for? What does it mean for Fed policy moving forward? If the supply chains continue to break down, inflation continues to rage on, how can the Fed keep the liquidity in the banking system? You start to see the big deal. But on a bigger deal, what does this mean for China? Could this be the end of the CCP? Can they stop the protests at this point? I don't know. You don't know. At some point, it's going to crumble, right? I believe that. Is this going to be the big one? I don't know. But something is going to give here. So either the CCP is going to step down, the people are going to win, or the CCP will be able to stop the protest, which is probably more likely right now. But are they going to be able to maintain this zero COVID policy? So even if they stop the descent, can they go back to these policies? Now, if they do, then what happens to their economy? They're already burning through their capital super fast. Their financial markets are already wobbling. I showed you the charts, their currency's plummeting. And so if they continue to keep people locked down, keep the manufacturing suppressed, then their economy continues to plummet. So they're in the proverbial rock and a hard place here. Either one, they can crush dissent, they can hold firm with their zero policy, and they can crash their whole economy. They can do that. Or, and then if they crash the whole economy, the government falls apart, they probably get wiped out anyway. Or they could relax the policy. They could say, fine, we'll get off this zero COVID policy, we'll relax it a little bit, we'll just do we'll do shorter quarantine periods and things like that. But if they do that, then the CCP, the Communist Party, is bending to the will of the people. What happens when they bend a little bit? Well, then the people get encouraged. The people say, whoa, look, we got them to cave a little bit. We should try a little bit harder next time, and they'll cave a little bit more. The CCP knows this, I'm sure. So they don't want to give in. But if they don't give in, then what happens? Then they crash the whole country. This is the proverbial rock and a hard place that we're talking about. Now, I don't know where you're at in the world. If you're not in China, it's interesting to pay attention. But it affects us no matter where we're at. Because if the dragon falls, which the dragon is falling, what happens? Well, rising unrest, failing communism, hopefully. But the unmanageable debt loads are going to be massive. We're going to see investors all over the world take a massive hit. Ray Dalio, I'm sure, will take a massive hit. I'm sure he's got heavy, heavy bags in China, which is why he pumps them so hard. But China has lots of other problems we've talked about before. Failing demographics. They have no energy. They can't grow their own food. They don't have enough water. And so many other things. And what it looks like with the dragon falling is that the USA's biggest challenger might finally be done. We might put a fork in China. It might be done. This could be it. This could be the spark that takes it down. But what do you think? I'd love to hear your opinion. You can leave me a comment down below. Of course, as always, give me a thumbs up on this video if you like it. If you don't, you can give me a thumbs down. I know sometimes you don't like when I do videos on China, but at least tell me why, explain why, so I can learn from you. All right, and that's what I got. To your success. I'm out.